picture this. You're fast asleep in your wooden house, pressed shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors in a maze of crooked streets so narrow you could shake hands across them. It's September 1666, and London is a tinderbox dressed up as a city. Your house isn't just your home, it's kindling. Your street isn't a neighborhood, it's a fuse. And tonight, someone's about to light the match that will turn your world into a screaming inferno that even hell would find impressive. Tonight, we're not just talking about the Great Fire of London. We're putting you right in the middle of it. Because, spoiler alert, you wouldn't make it through the first night. So dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background noise. And let's explore why your medieval survival instincts would be about as useful as a chocolate teapot in the face of one of history's most devastating urban disasters. Why you wouldn't last a day as a London resident during the Great Fire. Let's start with the most uncomfortable truth. If you lived in 1666 London, you were already living on borrowed time before the fire even started. Your house, like every other building crammed into this medieval maze, was essentially a wooden death trap with pretensions of being architecture. Imagine waking up on September 2nd, 1666, in your typical London home. The first thing that would hit you isn't the smell of smoke, not yet anyway, but the overwhelming stench that was just normal life. Your house sits above a cesspit that hasn't been properly cleaned in months. The streets outside reek of human waste, rotting food, and the thousand other odors of a city, where 400,000 people lived in conditions that would make a modern prison seem luxurious. Your house itself would shock you. The walls are made of wattle and daub, basically twigs and mud held together by hope and habit. The timber frame is dry as bone after one of the hottest summers on record. There's been no meaningful rain for months, and your wooden home has been baking in the heat like kindling prepared for a bonfire. The upper floors jut out over the street, each level extending further than the one below, creating a canopy of combustible material that blocks out most sunlight and creates perfect wind tunnels for flames to race through. You share this fire hazard with your entire family, possibly some lodgers, and definitely with rats, fleas, and other creatures that would be more than happy to flee a burning building much faster than you ever could. Your windows, if you're lucky enough to have them, are small and filled with expensive glass, or, more likely, oiled paper or cloth. Either way, they're not big enough to serve as escape routes when the time comes. But here's where your modern sensibilities would really betray you. You have no concept of fire safety as we understand it today. There are no smoke detectors, no fire extinguishers, no building codes, no emergency services as we know them. The closest thing to a fire department is a handful of parish constables with leather buckets and a prayer. Your neighbors aren't trained in fire suppression. They're trained in minding their own business and hoping disasters happen to someone else. When you first smell smoke that Sunday morning, your reaction would probably be to ignore it. Smoke was everywhere in London. Every house had multiple fires burning, candles flickering, and coal or wood burning constantly for cooking and heat. The air was so perpetually hazy with smoke that clear sky was actually remarkable enough to comment on. So when that first whiff of something burning reaches your nose, you'd likely dismiss it as just another neighbor cooking breakfast or warming their home against the unseasonably cool morning. But this isn't just any fire. This is the fire that started in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. And it's about to teach you exactly why medieval London was basically a giant campfire waiting for someone to forget to put it out properly. The bakery, like your house, like every building around you, was a wooden structure stuffed with combustible materials. Flour, dust in the air, dry wood everywhere, and ovens that had been burning hot all night. By the time you realize this isn't just someone's chimney acting up, the fire has already begun its race through your neighborhood with the enthusiasm of a child unwrapping presents. The wind, which had been building strength all morning, catches the flames and begins hurling burning debris from house to house like nature's own artillery bombardment. Here's what you don't understand about fire that would absolutely doom you. Medieval fires don't behave like modern fires. They don't start small and build up gradually in buildings designed with fire safety in mind. They explode. The combination of bone-dry wood, tightly packed buildings, and strong winds creates something called a firestorm, where the fire generates its own weather system. The heat becomes so intense that it creates powerful updrafts that suck in more air, feeding the flames and creating winds that can reach hurricane force. Your first instinct would probably be to grab some belongings and flee, but this is where your lack of medieval fire experience would kill you. You'd waste precious time trying to save things that don't matter, or worse. You'd try to fight the fire with methods that were inadequate, even by 1666 standards. Maybe you'd throw a bucket of water on flames that are already consuming your neighbor's house, or attempt to create a fire break by pulling down burning thatch with your bare hands. What you wouldn't understand is that this fire is moving faster than you can run, and it's about to cut off your escape routes in ways that would seem impossible to a modern person. The streets of London weren't laid out in a sensible grid system. They were a tangled mess of alleys, dead ends, and passages so narrow that two people could barely pass each other. Many streets were so convoluted that even locals got lost in their own neighborhoods. As the fire spreads, these narrow passages become death traps. The buildings on either side are now walls of flame, and the street between them becomes like the inside of a furnace. The heat radiating from both sides would be enough to kill you through heat stroke before the actual flames reached you. The smoke, thick and black and toxic, would fill these narrow passages like poison gas in a trench, suffocating anyone who tried to navigate them. But let's say you somehow avoid immediate death by fire or suffocation. You still have to deal with the human chaos that would be completely outside your modern experience. Panic in medieval London wasn't just people running around screaming, though there was plenty of that. It was 400,000 people with no disaster training, no emergency protocols, and no leadership suddenly trying to save themselves and their families from an unprecedented catastrophe. The streets become rivers of humanity, but rivers that flow in all directions at once as people change their minds about which way safety lies. Families get separated in the crush, children are trampled. The elderly and disabled are simply left behind because there's no social safety net, no emergency services to help them, and in the panic, it becomes survival of the fastest and strongest. Your modern instincts would be to look for authority figures, for someone in charge who could coordinate an evacuation or provide information about safe routes. But the authorities in 1666 London were as clueless and panicked as everyone else. The Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, would become famous for dismissing the fire early on, saying a woman could piss it out. By the time he realized his mistake, the situation was already beyond any medieval authority's ability to control. The fire spreads not just through direct contact, but through radiant heat and flying embers. Buildings that seemed safely distant suddenly burst into flames as burning debris lands on their roofs, or the sheer heat ignites their sun-baked timbers. You might think you've found safety, only to discover that the fire has somehow gotten ahead of you, cutting off your planned escape route and forcing you deeper into the maze of burning streets. And here's perhaps the most terrifying part. You can't see where the fire ends. In our modern world, we're used to being able to get information about disasters. We have news reports, emergency broadcasts, Maps showing safe areas. In 1666 London, you have nothing but your own eyes, ears, and the conflicting reports of other panicked people who know as little as you do. The smoke is so thick that day turns to night. The heat is so intense that people report seeing the lead from church roofs, melting and flowing down the streets like rivers of silver. The noise is indescribable, a combination of crackling flames, collapsing buildings, screaming people, and panicking animals that creates a wall of sound that makes it impossible to hear important information or communicate with your family. You're not just fighting the fire, you're fighting medieval London itself. The city's layout, its building materials, its lack of emergency infrastructure, its social systems. Everything that made it function in normal times becomes a weapon against you when disaster strikes. The very things that allowed 400,000 people to live in such a small space. The tightly packed buildings, the narrow streets, the shared walls and connected roofs, all become accelerants for the disaster that's consuming your world. Your clothes, if you're dressed like a typical London resident, are made of wool, linen, or other natural fibers that will catch fire easily if touched by sparks or embers. Your shoes, if you have them, are leather that will shrink and burn, leaving you barefoot on streets that are becoming too hot to walk on. Your hair, unwashed and possibly treated with oils or pomades, becomes another fire hazard attached to your head. Even if you somehow navigate the burning streets and avoid immediate death, you're facing challenges that your modern mind simply isn't prepared for. Where do you go when your entire neighborhood is on fire? London in 1666 doesn't have refugee centers or emergency shelters. The fields outside the city become massive camps of displaced people with no food, no sanitation, and no organization. Thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands, are all trying to flee the city at the same time, carrying whatever possessions they could grab. Leading animals, pushing carts, all converging on the same limited number of routes out of the city. The gates and bridges become bottlenecks, where the crowd pressure alone could crush you to death. But here's where we pause for a moment and check in with our loyal listeners. I'd love to know where you're checking in from and what time it is there. Are you settling in for the night, or maybe starting your day with some catastrophically calming history? Take a moment to let me know in the comments where you are and how you're enjoying this journey through one of London's darkest days. And if you're finding yourself oddly relaxed by this tale of urban disaster, maybe hit that like button. But only if you genuinely enjoy these deep explorations into history's more challenging moments. Subscribe if you want to join our growing community of people who find comfort in learning about times when life was significantly more difficult than our current struggles. What other historical disasters or challenging periods would you like us to explore together? Your suggestions help shape our little corner of the internet. And your continued support means everything to our growing community of history enthusiasts who appreciate the darker, more complex stories from our past. The reality is, even if you survived the initial escape from your burning neighborhood, you'd be facing days and weeks of challenges that would test every limit of human endurance. The Great Fire of London didn't just burn for a few hours and then get put out. It raged for 4 days and nights, consuming everything in its path and fundamentally changing not just the physical landscape of the city, but the lives of everyone who called London home. Your medieval survival skills, such as they were, would be tested not just by the immediate fire, but by the aftermath that followed. But that's a story for our next segments, where we'll explore exactly how this disaster unfolded, the people who lived through it, and the incredible mysteries that still surround one of history's most devastating urban fires. But let's dig deeper into exactly why you, as a modern person, would be so catastrophically unprepared for this disaster. Your understanding of fire itself would work against you. In our world, fires are generally contained events. House fires, while tragic, usually affect one building or at most a small area before firefighters arrive. Wildfires, while larger, move in predictable patterns that we can track and prepare for. The Great Fire of London was neither of these things. This fire created its own weather. The intense heat generated massive convection currents that lifted burning debris hundreds of feet into the air, then deposited it miles away from the main fire front. You might think you're safely upwind of the flames, only to have burning thatch or wooden shingles rain down on you from the sky like fiery snow. The fire was literally jumping over rivers, crossing supposedly fireproof barriers, and igniting buildings that should have been completely safe. Your clothing would become your enemy in ways you wouldn't expect. The natural fibers worn in 1666 don't just burn, they burn in specific ways that would doom you. Linen, which many people wore as undergarments, burns quickly and intensely. Wool, common in outer garments, burns more slowly but creates a clingy, melting mass that would stick to your skin. Your hat, probably made of felt, would become a torch on your head. Even your stockings would become fire hazards as they caught sparks and embers. The tools available to fight fire would seem laughably inadequate to your modern sensibilities. Fire engines didn't exist. The closest thing was a wheeled water tank that had to be manually pumped, and there weren't many of them. Most firefighting was done with leather buckets passed from hand to hand in human chains from the nearest water source. But here's the thing that would shock you. Even when these bucket brigades worked perfectly, they could barely produce enough water to keep a single building wet, let alone actually extinguish flames. Your modern faith in authority and organization would be shattered within hours. You'd expect someone to take charge, to coordinate evacuations, to provide information about safe routes or refuge areas. Instead, you'd find a power vacuum filled with confusion, contradictory orders, and officials who were just as panicked and uninformed as everyone else. The king himself, Charles II, would eventually take a personal hand in fighting the fire. Not because he was a great leader, but because literally no one else knew what to do. The social dynamics would be alien to you as well. In our modern disasters, we generally try to help each other, to work together for survival. But in 1666 London, social hierarchy and prejudice didn't disappear just because the city was burning. Poor people were blamed for starting the fire. Foreign residents, particularly French and Dutch immigrants, were attacked by mobs who convinced themselves that the fire was part of a foreign plot. You might find yourself in the bizarre situation of fleeing not just from flames, but from your fellow survivors who had decided you looked suspicious. Your modern diet and physical condition would work against you too. People in 1666 were tougher in many ways, more accustomed to physical hardship, hunger, and discomfort. They could walk for miles carrying heavy loads because that's what daily life required. You, accustomed to cars, elevators, and sedentary work, would find yourself exhausted and struggling while people around you seemed to have reserves of strength you simply couldn't match. The psychological impact would be devastating in ways you couldn't prepare for. Modern people experiencing disasters at least have the comfort of knowing that help is coming, that the disaster will end, that there are systems in place to help them recover. In 1666 London, you'd have no such assurances. For all you knew, this could be the end of the world, the apocalypse that preachers had been warning about. Many people genuinely believed they were witnessing divine judgment, and that belief would affect how they behaved, who they helped, and whether they even tried to save themselves. Your most basic assumptions about urban life would prove deadly. You'd assume that stone buildings were safe, not knowing that the intense heat would cause stone to crack and crumble. You'd think that crossing the river would mean safety, not realizing that burning debris was being carried across the Thames by the wind. You'd believe that getting away from the wooden buildings would protect you, not understanding that the fire was so hot it was igniting things that shouldn't burn at all. For now, rest assured that you're safe in your modern world with your smoke detectors, fire departments, and buildings designed with safety in mind. The London of 1666 was a different world entirely, one where survival often came down to luck as much as skill, and where a simple baker's oven could change the course of history and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in just a few short days. The man who started it all, Thomas Fariner, and the 4 days that changed London forever. Now that we've established just how spectacularly unprepared you'd be for this disaster, let's meet the man whose carelessness sparked one of history's most devastating urban fires. Thomas Fariner wasn't trying to burn down London. He was just a baker trying to make an honest living on Pudding Lane, a narrow street in the heart of medieval London's commercial district. But his story, and the 4 days that followed his fateful mistake, reveals how quickly ordinary life can transform into extraordinary catastrophe. Thomas Fariner was what we might call a successful small business owner today. He held the contract to bake ship's biscuits for the Royal Navy, a lucrative government contract that required him to keep his ovens burning hot well into the night to meet demand. His bakery on Pudding Lane was typical of London's commercial buildings, a wooden structure with his shop on the ground floor, family living quarters above, and servants' rooms in the attic. What made his bakery particularly dangerous was its location in one of London's most densely packed commercial areas, surrounded by warehouses full of combustible goods, oil, spirits, and all manner of materials that would feed a fire like kindling feeds a campfire. On the night of September 1st, 1666, Fariner followed his usual routine. He banked his ovens, a process that involved covering the coals with ash to keep them smouldering overnight, so they could be easily rekindled in the morning. This was standard practice for bakers, but it required careful attention to ensure the coals were properly contained. Fariner would later swear that he checked his ovens 3 times before going to bed, insisting that they were safely banked and posed no danger. But sometime in the early hours of September 2nd, something went wrong. Whether it was a coal that wasn't properly covered, a spark that found its way to some combustible material, or simply the accumulated heat in his bone-dry wooden building reaching a critical point, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Fariner was awakened around 1 in the morning by smoke and flames already consuming the lower part of his building. Here's where Fariner's story becomes a testament to both medieval ingenuity and the arbitrary nature of survival. Trapped in his upper floor with his family and servants, Fariner made a desperate decision that probably saved his life. Rather than try to escape down through the burning building or wait for rescue that wasn't coming, he led his family out through an upstairs window and across the rooftops of neighboring buildings. This was actually a common escape route in medieval London, where buildings were packed so tightly together that you could literally step from one roof to another. Fariner, his wife, and his daughter successfully made this terrifying journey across the burning rooftops in the dark, guided only by the growing light of the flames consuming their home and business. But not everyone in the household was so fortunate. Fariner's maid, whose name history hasn't preserved, was too frightened to make the leap from window to roof. She stayed behind, becoming the Great Fire's first victim, though certainly not its last, as Fariner watched his bakery burn from the safety of a neighboring rooftop. He had no idea he was witnessing the birth of a disaster that would consume most of medieval London. The fire that started in his ovens was about to embark on a 4-day rampage that would fundamentally change not just the physical landscape of London, but the course of English history itself. The first day of the fire, September 2nd, saw the flames spread with terrifying speed through the maze of wooden buildings surrounding Pudding Lane. The area was perfect for fire propagation. It was home to warehouses storing oil, spirits, and other flammable goods. The buildings were old, dry, and packed together so tightly that fire could jump from one to another without any help from wind or flying embers. By Sunday morning, the fire had consumed Farriner's entire neighborhood and was racing toward the Thames. But it was the wind that transformed Farriner's bakery fire from a local disaster into a city-wide catastrophe. A strong easterly wind had been building throughout the night, and by morning it was gusting with enough force to carry burning debris across streets, over supposed fire breaks, and even across the River Thames itself. This wasn't just wind, it was nature providing the perfect conditions for fire to spread faster than anyone could react. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, became an unwitting character in this unfolding tragedy through his spectacular misjudgment of the situation. When first informed of the fire on Sunday morning, Bloodworth dismissed it with words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Pish. A woman could piss it out. This wasn't just arrogance. It reflected the typical response of authorities to fires in London, which were common and usually contained to a few buildings. Bloodworth had no framework for understanding what was actually happening, no precedent for a fire that could consume an entire city. By Sunday afternoon, Bloodworth's confidence had evaporated, along with any hope of containing the fire through traditional methods. The flames had reached Fish Street Hill and were climbing toward London Bridge, the city's main crossing point over the Thames. The bridge itself was lined with buildings, shops, and homes, essentially creating a wooden tunnel filled with people and combustible goods suspended over the river. If the fire reached London Bridge, it wouldn't just destroy the bridge. It would trap thousands of people on the wrong side of the Thames, with no way to escape the advancing flames. This is where we meet another key figure in our story, King Charles II himself. Unlike many monarchs of his era, Charles didn't retreat to safety when disaster struck his capital. Instead, he took personal command of the firefighting efforts, riding through the burning streets, coordinating bucket brigades, and even taking a hand at pulling down buildings to create fire breaks. This wasn't just royal theatre. Charles seemed to genuinely understand that the survival of his capital, and possibly his kingdom, depended on stopping this fire. But even royal intervention couldn't match the scale of what was happening. By Monday, September 3rd, the second day of the fire, the flames had consumed everything between the Tower of London and London Bridge. The fire was now attacking the city on multiple fronts, spreading north toward Cornhill and Lombard Street, west toward the Royal Exchange, and south toward the warehouses along the Thames. What had started as a bakery fire was now a firestorm covering square miles of the densest urban area in Europe. The human drama unfolding during these days was beyond anything Thomas Farriner could have imagined. When he first smelled smoke in his bedroom, families were separated in the chaos of evacuation. Children were lost in the crowds. Elderly and disabled people were abandoned because there was simply no way to move them quickly enough to stay ahead of the flames. The Thames became a highway of refugees as people loaded boats and barges with whatever possessions they could save, creating a floating traffic jam of desperate humanity. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist whose detailed records give us our best first-hand account of the fire, captured the surreal nature of the disaster. He wrote of seeing people throwing their belongings into the Thames, rather than let them burn. Of crowds so thick that movement was nearly impossible, of the sky so dark with smoke that day looked like night. Pepys himself spent the fire frantically trying to save his wine collection and his naval papers, burying them in his garden like a pirate hiding treasure. By Tuesday, September 4th, the third day of the fire, the situation had moved beyond catastrophic into something approaching apocalyptic. The fire had reached the heart of the City of London, consuming the Royal Exchange, the commercial centre of English trade, and was now threatening some of the most important buildings in the kingdom. The Guildhall, the ancient seat of London's government, was burning. Dozens of churches were in flames, their lead roofs melting and flowing down the streets like metallic rivers. It was on this day that the fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral, the magnificent Gothic church that had dominated London's skyline for centuries. The cathedral seemed like it should have been fireproof. It was built of stone, it was surrounded by open space, and it was far enough from the original fire site that it should have been safe. But the heat generated by the surrounding fires was so intense that it ignited the cathedral's wooden scaffolding, which had been erected for ongoing renovations. The scaffolding acted like a giant torch, and soon the entire cathedral was ablaze. The destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral marked a psychological turning point for Londoners. If this ancient, sacred, seemingly indestructible building could burn, then nothing was safe. The fire wasn't just destroying their homes and businesses, it was consuming their landmarks, their history, their sense of permanence and security. People began to believe they were witnessing the end of their world, that this fire was divine judgment or foreign invasion or some other force beyond human understanding or control. Wednesday, September 5th, the fourth day of the fire, saw the flames finally begin to exhaust their fuel supply, not because the fire had been successfully fought, but because it had simply run out of things to burn. The wind that had fed the fire for days finally began to calm, removing the force that had been driving the flames forward faster than anyone could react. Firefighting efforts, which had been largely futile for the first 3 days, finally began to have some effect. But the London that emerged from the smoke and ash was unrecognizable. The fire had consumed over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of the medieval city of London. The area inside the old Roman walls, the ancient heart of the city, was almost completely destroyed. An estimated 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of London's population, were homeless. The economic damage was incalculable, not just from the destroyed buildings and goods, but from the disruption to trade and commerce that would last for years. Thomas Fariner survived the fire that started in his bakery, but his life was forever changed by those 4 days in September. He was investigated, questioned, and blamed by many for the disaster that had consumed their city, though he was never formally charged with any crime. He lived under the shadow of being the man whose carelessness had destroyed medieval London. He rebuilt his bakery on the same site, but he could never escape the knowledge that his name would be forever linked with one of the greatest disasters in English history. The fire's aftermath revealed the medieval city's complete lack of disaster planning or recovery infrastructure. There were no relief organizations, no government programs for displaced people, no insurance system to help rebuild. Families who had lost everything had to depend on charity, relatives, or their own resources to survive. Many never recovered their former prosperity, and some never recovered at all. Yet from this destruction came opportunity. The Great Fire cleared away centuries of accumulated medieval urban development, creating a blank slate for rebuilding London according to more modern principles. Christopher Wren, the great architect, would design a new St. Paul's Cathedral and dozens of new churches. The new London would have wider streets, better fire prevention, and building codes designed to prevent another such disaster. The personal stories that emerged from those 4 days reveal the true human cost of Farina's midnight mistake. Take the case of John Evelyn, another famous diarist of the period, who watched the fire consume his beloved city from across the Thames. Evelyn described seeing people so desperate to save their possessions that they threw furniture and goods into the river, only to watch helplessly as these items floated away or sank, representing years of hard work and savings lost in moments of panic. He wrote of seeing entire families standing on the riverbank with nothing but the clothes on their backs, having lost not just their homes, but their trades, their tools, their very means of survival. The fire created heroes in the most unlikely places. James, Duke of York, the future James II, worked alongside common firefighters, his royal robes singed and his hands blackened from hauling buckets and wielding fire hooks. He organized the demolition crews that worked frantically to create fire breaks by pulling down buildings in the fire's path. This wasn't ceremonial leadership. The Duke was literally in the trenches, or rather the burning streets, making life or death decisions about which buildings to sacrifice to save others. But the fire also revealed the ugly realities of class and prejudice that normally remained hidden beneath the surface of London society. Foreign residents, particularly the French and Dutch communities, became scapegoats for a disaster that clearly had natural causes. Mobs attacked immigrant neighborhoods, not because there was any evidence of foreign involvement, but because people needed someone to blame for their suffering. French Catholics were especially targeted, with rumors spreading that the fire was part of a papal plot to destroy Protestant England. These attacks continued even as the evidence clearly pointed to the fire starting in Farina's English Protestant bakery. The economic implications of the fire extended far beyond the immediate destruction. London was the commercial heart of England, and many of the burned buildings contained not just homes and shops, but warehouses full of goods from around the world: silk from Asia, spices from the Indies, tobacco from America, all went up in smoke. The Royal Exchange, which had been the center of international trade, contained merchants' goods worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. When it burned on the 3rd day of the fire, it didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed the financial instruments and records that made international commerce possible. The fire's impact on London's religious life was particularly devastating. The destruction of 87 churches meant that entire parishes lost not just their places of worship, but their community centers, their record-keeping systems, and often their only sources of poor relief. Church registers containing centuries of baptisms, marriages, and burials were turned to ash, erasing the documented history of thousands of families. Some parishes would never recover, their congregations scattered to the winds and their boundaries redrawn to accommodate the new reality of a city with far fewer places of worship. The psychological trauma extended beyond the immediate victims. People throughout England and Europe heard about London's destruction and wondered if the same fate could befall their own cities. The fire sparked a wave of fire prevention efforts across Europe as authorities suddenly realized how vulnerable their own medieval cities were to similar disasters. New building codes, fire prevention ordinances, and emergency response systems were implemented in cities that had never experienced anything like London's catastrophe. Samuel Pepys, in his detailed diary entries, captured the almost surreal quality of life during those 4 days. He wrote about attending dinner parties where hosts served their best wine and food, reasoning that it would either be consumed by their guests or consumed by the fire, so they might as well enjoy it while they could. He described the bizarre sight of people living in tents in the fields outside London, creating temporary cities of refugees that looked more like military camps than civilian settlements. The fire also created unexpected moments of generosity and human connection. Wealthy merchants opened their country houses to strangers who had lost everything. Guilds and trade organizations pooled their resources to help members rebuild. King Charles II personally donated money for fire relief, and even ordered the royal kitchens to provide free bread to the homeless. These acts of kindness stood in stark contrast to the xenophobia and class tensions that the disaster also revealed. Thomas Fariner himself became something of a tragic figure in the aftermath. While never formally prosecuted, he faced years of suspicion and blame from his fellow Londoners. Some customers refused to buy from his rebuilt bakery, viewing him as the man who had destroyed their city. Others defended him, pointing out that any baker in London could have made the same mistake, and that the real problem was the city's medieval infrastructure, not one man's momentary carelessness. The fire's timeline reveals just how quickly urban civilization can unravel. On September 1st, London was one of Europe's great cities, a thriving metropolis of trade and culture. By September 6th, most of medieval London was gone, reduced to smoking ruins and ash-filled streets. 5 days to destroy what had taken centuries to build. This wasn't a gradual decline or a slow-burning crisis. It was sudden, total, and irreversible transformation. The weather itself seemed to conspire against the city during those 4 days. Not only was there the constant easterly wind that drove the flames forward, but the summer of 1666 had been unusually hot and dry, leaving all the wooden structures in London as parched as tinder. When rain finally came on September 6th, it was too late to save medieval London, but just in time to prevent the fire from spreading to the western suburbs where many of the wealthy had their homes. But that's a story of recovery and renewal, of how London rose from the ashes of Thomas Fariner's careless night. The immediate story, the story of those 4 days in September 1666, remains one of how quickly civilization can collapse when the systems we depend on prove inadequate to the challenges they face. It's the story of ordinary people like Fariner, whose small mistakes can have enormous consequences, and of how disaster reveals both the best and worst of human nature under extreme pressure. The mysteries that still burn, unsolved questions, and strange discoveries from the ashes. As the smoke clears from our exploration of Thomas Fariner's catastrophic mistake and the 4 days that transformed London forever, we find ourselves standing in the ruins of medieval England's greatest city, surrounded by mysteries that have puzzled investigators for over 3 centuries. The Great Fire didn't just destroy buildings and lives. It created a collection of enigmas that continue to burn in the minds of historians, archaeologists, and conspiracy theorists today. Some of these puzzles challenge everything we think we know about how the fire spread. Others question whether we've been told the complete truth about who was involved, and still others reveal secrets that were literally buried beneath London's streets until the flames exposed them to daylight. Let's begin with the most haunting question of all. Was the Great Fire of London really just a baker's accident, or are we looking at history's most successful cover-up? The official story seems straightforward enough. Thomas Fariner's oven started a fire that got out of control. But when you start examining the details, uncomfortable questions emerge that have never been satisfactorily answered. Consider the timing. The fire began at exactly the right moment to cause maximum devastation. It started on a Sunday morning when most Londoners were either sleeping late or preparing for church, giving the flames precious hours to establish themselves before any organized response could form. It ignited during one of the driest summers on record, after months without meaningful rainfall had turned every wooden building in London into seasoned kindling. The wind patterns were perfect, strong and steady from the east, driving the fire directly into the heart of the city's most densely packed commercial district. But here's where the official story starts to unravel under scrutiny. Experienced Londoners knew fire. They lived with it every day in a city where every building had multiple fireplaces, where candles and oil lamps provided the only artificial light, where forges and ovens burned constantly. They understood how fast fire typically spread through their wooden neighborhoods. Yet multiple eyewitnesses reported that this fire was moving faster than should have been physically possible. More disturbing still were the reports of multiple fires starting simultaneously in locations too far apart to be explained by wind-carried embers or radiant heat. Several witnesses claimed to see suspicious figures near burning buildings in the early hours of the disaster, shadowy people who disappeared when approached and couldn't be identified later. These reports were dismissed at the time as panic-induced hallucinations, but they keep appearing in contemporary accounts with disturbing consistency. The most famous mystery involves a French watchmaker named Robert Hubert, whose confession to starting the fire created more questions than it answered. Hubert claimed he had thrown a fireball through the window of Farriner's bakery, setting off the catastrophe that destroyed medieval London. He was tried, convicted, and executed for this crime, providing the authorities with a convenient foreign scapegoat for England's greatest urban disaster. But Hubert's story fell apart under examination. His description of Pudding Lane was wildly inaccurate. He couldn't identify Farriner's bakery when brought to the location. Most damning of all, shipping records later proved that Hubert hadn't even arrived in London until 2 days after the fire started. Yet despite this overwhelming evidence of his innocence, or at least his inability to have committed the crime he confessed to, authorities executed him anyway. Why would someone confess to a crime they clearly didn't commit, especially one that carried a death sentence? Some historians suggest Hubert was mentally ill, seeking attention or punishment for imagined sins. Others propose more sinister explanations. Was Hubert coerced into confessing to protect the real culprits? Was his execution a convenient way to end official investigation into alternative theories about the fire's origin? His death certainly closed the books on any uncomfortable questions about conspiracy or sabotage. The archaeological treasures revealed by the fire's destruction tell their own mysterious story. When the flames cleared away medieval London, they exposed layers of the city's hidden history that had been buried for centuries. Roman foundations emerged from beneath collapsed buildings, revealing the sophisticated urban planning of ancient Londinium. Saxon artifacts surfaced from construction sites, telling the story of London's Dark Age transformation. Medieval structures appeared that weren't recorded in any historical documents, suggesting that our understanding of London's development is far from complete. One of the most intriguing discoveries came from the ruins of Old St. Paul's Cathedral, when the medieval structure burned, exposing its foundations. Investigators found evidence of not just one previous church, but several churches built on the same sacred site over more than 1,000 years. Hidden chambers beneath the cathedral floor contained lead coffins with bodies preserved in remarkable condition, creating an accidental time capsule of London's inhabitants across the centuries. But perhaps the strangest archaeological mystery involves the discovery of what appeared to be deliberate fire breaks in some areas of medieval London. These were gaps in building construction that seemed designed to prevent fires from spreading, but they predated any known fire prevention regulations by decades or even centuries. Who created these fire breaks? When and why were they built? Some historians suggest they were remnants of Roman urban planning, evidence that ancient engineers understood fire risk better than we've given them credit for. Others propose they were created by medieval authorities who had secret knowledge of London's fire vulnerability. A few conspiracy-minded researchers suggest they might have been created specifically in preparation for the Great Fire, though this theory lacks credible evidence. The very existence of these fire breaks raises uncomfortable questions about how much medieval authorities really understood about their city's vulnerabilities, and whether some people might have been better prepared for disaster than historical records suggest. The fire's unusual burning patterns created mysteries that fire investigators still struggle to explain. In some areas, the flames consumed everything with devastating thoroughness, leaving nothing but ash and melted metal. But in other locations, seemingly random buildings survived untouched, while everything around them was completely destroyed. St. Dunstan in the East Church, for example, suffered minimal damage despite being surrounded by buildings that were reduced to rubble. Modern fire science has identified several aspects of the Great Fire's behavior that don't match typical urban fire patterns. The fire jumped the Thames in multiple locations, something that should have been nearly impossible given the river's width and the lack of bridges or other crossing points for flames to follow. It ignited stone buildings that should have been fireproof, generating temperatures hot enough to crack and crumble solid masonry. In some documented cases, the fire seemed to burn upward and backward against prevailing winds, defying basic physics of combustion and air movement. These anomalies have led some researchers to propose that the fire created multiple microweather systems, generating its own atmospheric conditions that operated independently of normal wind patterns. The intense heat would have created powerful convection currents, lifting burning debris high into the air and depositing it miles from the original fire site. But even this explanation doesn't account for all the unusual phenomena reported by eyewitnesses. One of the most puzzling aspects involves the behavior of animals during the disaster. Contemporary accounts describe horses, dogs, cats, and even birds displaying highly unusual behavior in the days leading up to the fire. Animals seemed agitated and restless, some refusing to enter certain buildings or areas that would later be consumed by flames. Horses bolted for no apparent reason. Dogs howled continuously. Cats disappeared from neighborhoods that would be destroyed within days. This could be explained by animals' superior ability to detect changes in air pressure, temperature, or atmospheric composition that humans might miss. But it raises an uncomfortable question. If the fire was truly accidental, starting suddenly in Farriner's bakery, why were animals apparently sensing danger days before any visible signs of fire appeared? Were there warning signs that humans missed or ignored? Or were there preliminary events, perhaps smaller fires or other incidents, that weren't recorded in historical documents? The fire's impact on London's underground infrastructure revealed another layer of mystery. Medieval London was honeycombed with cellars, tunnels, crypts, and underground chambers, many of which had been forgotten by the time of the fire. When buildings collapsed into these subterranean spaces, they exposed a hidden world beneath the city that told stories no historical documents had preserved. Some of these underground areas contained artifacts and architectural features that didn't match any known historical periods. Roman construction techniques were found in areas that shouldn't have had Roman settlements. Saxon artifacts appeared in locations that historical records suggested were uninhabited during the Saxon period. Medieval structures were discovered that used building techniques not documented anywhere else in England. Archaeological investigations have also revealed evidence of previous major fires that weren't recorded in surviving historical documents. Layers of ash and burned material beneath medieval foundations suggest that London experienced several catastrophic fires throughout its history, disasters that were either not documented or whose records were lost over time. This raises the possibility that the Great Fire of 1666 wasn't unprecedented. but rather the latest in a series of urban disasters that occurred more frequently than we've realized. Perhaps most mysteriously, several contemporary accounts describe unusual atmospheric phenomena during the fire that don't match typical fire behavior. Witnesses reported seeing strange colors in the flames, brilliant blues and greens that shouldn't appear in wood or coal fires. They heard unexplained sounds, musical tones, and rhythmic noises that didn't match the typical crackling and roaring of burning buildings. Some described smoke patterns that seemed to move independently of wind direction, creating spirals and geometric shapes that defied natural explanation. A few witnesses claimed to see ball lightning or other electrical phenomena during the fire, glowing orbs that floated through the smoke and flames without being affected by heat or wind. While these accounts might be explained by the extreme atmospheric conditions created by such a massive fire, they add another layer of mystery to an already complex event. Modern atmospheric scientists studying these historical accounts have been unable to fully explain some of the phenomena described by otherwise reliable eyewitnesses. The recovery period after the fire revealed additional puzzles that historians still struggle to understand. The speed and efficiency with which London was rebuilt has surprised researchers studying the period. Given the primitive construction techniques, limited transportation, and basic tools available in the 1660s, the reconstruction should have taken decades. Instead, much of London was rebuilt within just a few years, suggesting either that the rebuilding effort was far better organized than historical records indicate, or that significant resources and planning had been prepared well in advance of the disaster. This raises uncomfortable questions about whether some people might have known that London's destruction was inevitable, or even imminent. Christopher Wren, the great architect who designed the new St. Paul's Cathedral and many of the replacement churches, had been proposing urban planning reforms for London for years before the fire. These reforms were consistently rejected by property owners and conservative city officials who saw no need for change. The fire conveniently cleared away all the legal and practical obstacles to urban renewal, allowing Wren and other planners to implement changes that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. While there's no evidence that anyone deliberately started or prolonged the fire for urban planning purposes, the convenient timing has raised eyebrows among some historians. The fire accomplished in 4 days what reformers had been trying to achieve for decades, clearing away medieval London's chaotic street plan and dangerous building practices to make way for a more modern, safer city. Modern chemical analysis of artifacts recovered from fire sites has revealed some puzzling results that don't match normal fire damage patterns. Some materials showed evidence of burning at temperatures much higher than wood, coal, or even oil fires should have been able to achieve. Other artifacts displayed chemical changes that suggest exposure to substances or conditions that weren't present in typical 17th century fires. These anomalies might be explained by unusual atmospheric conditions during the fire, or by the presence of unknown chemical compounds in some of the burned buildings. Warehouses near the Thames contained goods from around the world, including spices, oils, spirits, and other materials that might have burned at unusual temperatures or created unexpected chemical reactions. But they also raise the possibility that some aspects of the fire's behavior still aren't fully understood, even after 3.5 centuries of investigation and analysis. The fire's impact on London's social and economic structures created patterns that persist today and continue to puzzle historians. Some families and businesses that were completely destroyed by the fire managed to rebuild and prosper very quickly, while others never recovered despite having better resources and connections before the disaster. The patterns of who thrived and who failed in the fire's aftermath don't always match. what we might expect based on their pre-fire circumstances. Some of the most successful post-fire rebuilding was accomplished by people who seemed to have access to resources, materials, or planning that they shouldn't have possessed. Foreign merchants who had lost everything were somehow able to re-establish their businesses within months. Craftsmen whose tools and workshops had been destroyed were back in operation with new equipment and facilities almost immediately. Meanwhile, some wealthy established families with extensive resources struggled for years to rebuild their former prosperity. These patterns suggest that factors we don't fully understand influenced both the destruction and recovery processes. Were there hidden support networks that helped certain people rebuild? Did some individuals or groups have advanced knowledge that allowed them to prepare for the disaster? Or were there post-fire assistance programs that weren't officially documented but provided crucial help to selected survivors? The Great Fire of London also had mysterious long-term effects on English urban development that extended far beyond the immediate reconstruction of the burned areas. Cities throughout England and Europe began implementing fire prevention measures and building codes in the years following London's disaster, even though most of these places had never experienced anything approaching London's catastrophe. This suggests that the fire's impact was felt as a wake-up call about urban fire risk across the entire continent. But some of the specific fire prevention measures adopted in other cities seemed to address problems that weren't obvious from London's experience. Building spacing requirements, water storage mandates, and construction material restrictions were implemented that went far beyond what London's fire should have taught other cities about fire risk. This raises the question of whether London's disaster revealed general principles about urban fire vulnerability that were already understood by some authorities, or whether there were other fires or near disasters that influenced these widespread policy changes. One of the most enduring puzzles involves the monument to the Great Fire, erected by Christopher Wren to commemorate the disaster. The monument stands exactly 202 feet tall, the same distance from its base to the spot where the fire started in Pudding Lane. But hidden within the monument's design are mathematical relationships and astronomical alignments that seem to have nothing to do with commemorating a fire. Some researchers have suggested that the monument contains encoded information about the fire's true causes or the identities of those involved in London's rebuilding. The Latin inscription on the monument originally blamed the fire on the treachery and malice of the Papists, reflecting the anti-Catholic sentiment of the time. This inscription was quietly removed in 1831, but it raises questions about what authorities really believed about the fire's origins. Was the Catholic conspiracy theory just convenient scapegoating, or did some people genuinely believe that the fire was an act of sabotage? The timing of the fire in relation to other historical events has also puzzled researchers. The Great Fire occurred just 1 year after the Great Plague had killed nearly a quarter of London's population. The city was still recovering from that disaster when the fire struck, creating a double catastrophe that should have been impossible to recover from. Yet London not only survived both disasters, but emerged stronger and more prosperous than before. Some historians have suggested that the plague and fire were connected in ways we don't fully understand. The fire certainly eliminated many of the conditions that had allowed the plague to spread, burning down the overcrowded, unsanitary neighborhoods where disease had flourished. Was this just a fortunate coincidence, or did the fire play a role in ending the plague that we haven't recognized? The mysteries surrounding the Great Fire of London remind us that even the most thoroughly documented historical events can still hold secrets waiting to be discovered. Each archaeological excavation in Old London, each analysis of newly discovered documents, each application of modern investigative techniques to Historical evidence has the potential to answer old questions or raise entirely new ones. Recent discoveries continue to add new dimensions to our understanding of the fire. In 2016, exactly 350 years after the disaster, archaeologists working on London construction sites uncovered new evidence of the fire's destruction patterns. Melted coins, ceramics fused by extreme heat, and building foundations that show evidence of temperatures far higher than previously thought possible all suggest that the fire was even more intense and destructive than historical accounts indicated. The fire that began in Thomas Farriner's bakery on that September morning in 1666 continues to burn in the minds of researchers and investigators more than 3 centuries after the last ember cooled. Whether it was truly an accident, a conspiracy, or something else entirely, the Great Fire remains one of history's most fascinating disasters, a catastrophe that changed not just London's physical landscape, but our understanding of how quickly urban civilization can be transformed by forces beyond our control or comprehension. Life among London's elite during the Great Fire, power, privilege, and survival when the world burns. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through the Great Fire of London, it's time to explore a completely different side of this catastrophic week. While Thomas Farriner and his fellow commoners faced death in the narrow, burning streets of medieval London, there was another world existing parallel to theirs, a world of wealth, power, and privilege that experienced the fire in ways that would seem almost surreal to the struggling masses. This is the story of how London's elite, the nobility, wealthy merchants, and government officials, navigated the same disaster that was destroying the lives of ordinary people, and how their resources, connections, and social position created survival opportunities that were simply unavailable to anyone else. Let's begin with King Charles II himself, whose response to the fire reveals both the advantages and limitations of absolute power when facing a natural disaster. While common Londoners were fleeing their burning neighborhoods with whatever they could carry, Charles had the luxury of viewing the fire as both a crisis to manage and a spectacle to observe. From the safety of Whitehall Palace, the king could watch the flames consume his capital while remaining physically secure, surrounded by guards, servants, and advisors, who ensured his comfort and safety even as the city burned around them. But Charles wasn't content to remain a distant observer. Unlike many monarchs who might have fled to the countryside at the first sign of danger, Charles took an active, hands-on role in fighting the fire. He rode through the burning streets, personally directing firefighting efforts and even taking a hand at the pumps and fire hooks used to create fire breaks. This wasn't just royal theatre, though it certainly served a political purpose. Charles seemed to genuinely understand that his legitimacy as king depended partly on being seen as a leader who shared his people's dangers. Yet even Charles's heroic firefighting came with advantages unavailable to common citizens. When the king worked alongside bucket brigades, he was surrounded by guards who ensured his safety. When he rode through burning neighborhoods, he had the best horses, the most reliable guides, and escape routes planned by people whose job was to protect him. Most importantly, Charles knew that no matter how dangerous the situation became, he had multiple palaces, country estates, and loyal supporters who could provide him with shelter, food, and security if London became uninhabitable. The contrast between royal firefighting and common survival becomes even starker when you consider what Charles was actually trying to save. While ordinary Londoners were desperately attempting to preserve their homes, their livelihoods, and their families, Charles was directing efforts to save strategically important buildings like the Tower of London, with its arsenal and treasury, and the naval yards that were crucial to English military power. The king's firefighting wasn't just about stopping the fire, it was about preserving the infrastructure of royal authority and national power. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist whose accounts give us our best window into the fire's impact, provides a perfect example of how the moderately wealthy experienced this disaster differently from the truly poor. Pepys was a rising government official, well-connected and financially secure, but not among London's true elite. His response to the fire reveals both the advantages of wealth and education, and the limits of middle-class resources when facing catastrophe. When Pepys first learned about the fire, his initial reaction wasn't panic, but curiosity. He walked to the Tower of London to get a better view of the flames, treating the early stages of the disaster almost like entertainment. This leisure to observe, rather than immediately flee, was itself a privilege unavailable to people whose homes and businesses were directly threatened. Pepys had the luxury of time to assess the situation, plan his response, and make rational decisions about what to save and where to go. But as the fire spread and threatened his own neighborhood, Pepys's response reveals the sophisticated survival strategies available to the educated and well-connected. Rather than simply grabbing whatever he could carry and fleeing like so many ordinary Londoners, Pepys implemented a carefully planned preservation strategy. He buried his wine collection and important naval documents in his garden, ensuring they would survive even if his house burned. He arranged for his wife and servants to evacuate with carefully selected possessions to the homes of friends and relatives outside the city. Most telling of all, Pepys spent considerable time and effort saving his diary, the very document that now provides us with our most detailed account of the fire. This decision reveals something profound about the difference between surviving as a wealthy, educated person versus surviving as a poor laborer. Pepys understood that his written records, his connections, and his reputation were valuable assets that could be rebuilt into future prosperity, even if his physical possessions were destroyed. A poor craftsman whose tools were burned had lost his ability to earn a living, but Pepys knew that his skills, knowledge, and social connections would allow him to rebuild his career regardless of what the fire destroyed. The truly wealthy members of London society experienced the fire in ways that bordered on the surreal. Take the case of the Earl of Craven, one of the richest men in England, whose London mansion was directly in the fire's path. Rather than flee or fight the flames, Craven apparently spent the fire hosting dinner parties for other displaced aristocrats, turning the disaster into a kind of social event. His house eventually burned, but Craven treated this as an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe, simply relocating his social gatherings to one of his country estates. This wasn't callous indifference to others' suffering, though it might seem that way to modern sensibilities. The wealthy understood that their survival didn't depend on any particular building or even any particular city. Their wealth was portable, invested in land, government bonds, and commercial ventures that extended far beyond London. The fire might destroy their London residences, but it couldn't touch their estates in the countryside, their investments in overseas trade, or their connections to the royal court. More importantly, the wealthy had access to resources and services that allowed them to not just survive the fire, but potentially profit from its aftermath. While poor Londoners were becoming refugees, wealthy merchants were already planning how to capitalize on the reconstruction effort. They had the capital to buy up fire-damaged land at reduced prices, the connections to secure rebuilding contracts, and the political influence to ensure that new building codes and city planning would favor their interests. The fire also revealed the sophisticated support networks available to London's elite. When wealthy families needed to evacuate, they didn't become homeless refugees camping in fields outside the city. They moved to the country houses of relatives, friends, and business associates, often turning their evacuation into extended social visits. These networks of mutual support among the wealthy created a kind of safety net that was simply unavailable to ordinary Londoners, who had to depend on charity or their own resources to survive displacement. Consider the case of Sir Christopher Wren, the architect who would later design the new St. Paul's Cathedral and many of the replacement churches. Wren wasn't just a talented architect, he was well connected to both the scientific community and the royal court. When the fire created opportunities for urban planning and architectural innovation, Wren was positioned to take advantage of them in ways that would have been impossible for someone without his social connections and royal patronage. But Wren's advantage went beyond just having the right connections. His education, his understanding of mathematics and engineering, and his access to books and scientific instruments allowed him to approach the fire's destruction as an opportunity for systematic urban improvement. While ordinary Londoners saw only devastation, Wren saw a chance to implement modern urban planning principles, improve fire safety, and create a more beautiful and functional city. The fire's impact on London's financial and commercial elite reveals another dimension of how wealth and privilege shaped survival strategies. The merchants and bankers who controlled London's economy weren't just trying to save their individual businesses. They were working to preserve the entire commercial system that had made them wealthy. They had the resources and influence to coordinate their response, sharing information about safe areas, pooling resources to hire private security, and working together to ensure that critical commercial infrastructure like warehouses and ports were protected. These wealthy merchants also had something that ordinary Londoners lacked: insurance. While formal fire insurance wouldn't become common until after the Great Fire, wealthy merchants had informal insurance arrangements through their trade associations and partnerships. If one merchant's warehouse burned, his partners and associates would help him rebuild, knowing that they might need similar help in the future. This created a kind of mutual aid society among the wealthy that provided security unavailable to individual craftsmen or laborers. The fire's aftermath revealed perhaps the starkest difference between wealthy and poor survival strategies. While ordinary Londoners faced years of struggle to rebuild their lives from nothing, the wealthy began planning London's reconstruction almost before the flames were extinguished. They had the capital to invest in new construction, the political influence to shape rebuilding policies, and the social connections to secure the most profitable reconstruction contracts. Christopher Wren's post-fire career illustrates this perfectly. Within months of the fire's end, Wren was appointed as one of the commissioners responsible for rebuilding London's churches. This wasn't just recognition of his architectural talent. It was a result of his connections to the royal court and his membership in the Royal Society, the prestigious scientific organization that included many of England's most influential intellectuals and politicians. The new London that emerged from the fire's ashes reflected the tastes, priorities, and interests of the wealthy and powerful people who controlled the reconstruction process. The new St. Paul's Cathedral was designed not just as a place of worship, but as a monument to English Protestant culture and royal power. The new churches were built in a classical style that reflected the educated elite's appreciation for ancient Greek and Roman architecture. The new street plan, while safer and more functional than medieval London's chaotic layout, also created opportunities for profitable real estate development by those who could afford to invest in the new city. But perhaps the most significant advantage enjoyed by London's elite was their ability to see the fire as ultimately beneficial rather than catastrophic. While the fire was undoubtedly traumatic and expensive for wealthy Londoners, it also cleared away obstacles to urban improvement that had persisted for centuries. The medieval cities, narrow streets, dangerous building practices, and chaotic layout had made London increasingly unsuitable for modern commerce and transportation. The fire solved these problems in 4 days, creating opportunities for development that might have taken decades to achieve through normal political and legal processes. This perspective allowed the wealthy to approach reconstruction with optimism and ambition rather than desperation. They weren't just trying to restore what had been lost, they were building something better. The new London would have wider streets for improved commerce, better fire prevention for increased safety, and more impressive architecture to reflect England's growing power and prosperity. The fire also strengthened the position of London's elite in national politics. The reconstruction effort required unprecedented cooperation between the Crown, Parliament, and the city government, creating new opportunities for wealthy Londoners to influence national policy. The building codes, urban planning principles, and architectural standards developed for London's reconstruction became models for other English cities, extending London elite influence throughout the kingdom. Yet for all their advantages, London's wealthy residents weren't immune to the fire's psychological and cultural impact. The destruction of medieval London meant the loss of buildings, neighborhoods, and institutions that had defined English urban life for centuries. Even wealthy families, who could easily afford to rebuild, faced the disorienting experience of seeing their familiar world literally turned to ash and smoke. The fire also challenged traditional assumptions about divine providence and social hierarchy that were central to 17th century elite culture. If God controlled all earthly events, why had he allowed such devastation to strike the Protestant capital of England? If wealth and social position reflected divine favor, why had the fire destroyed the homes of nobles and commoners alike? These theological and philosophical questions would influence English religious and political thought for generations. As we reach the end of our journey through the Great Fire of London, we're left with a complex picture of how disaster affects different social classes in fundamentally different ways. The fire that would have killed you as an ordinary medieval Londoner was transformed into an opportunity for profit and improvement by those with sufficient wealth and power to shape its aftermath. This isn't to diminish the real losses suffered by London's elite, or to suggest that wealth made the fire's trauma insignificant for those who possessed it. But it does reveal how social and economic inequality creates vastly different experiences of the same disaster. The fire that represented existential catastrophe for Thomas Fariner and his fellow commoners became a chance for urban renewal and architectural innovation for Christopher Wren and his fellow elites. The Great Fire of London ultimately reminds us that disasters are never truly natural or neutral events. They always interact with existing social, economic, and political structures in ways that can either reinforce or challenge existing inequalities. In the case of the Great Fire, the disaster largely reinforced existing power structures, allowing the wealthy to rebuild London according to their vision, while ordinary Londoners struggled to rebuild their individual lives. As you settle back into your modern world with its fire departments, building codes, and disaster relief systems, remember that these safety nets didn't exist in 1666 London. But also remember that even today, wealth and privilege continue to shape who survives disasters and who thrives in their aftermath. The Great Fire of London may have happened over 3 centuries ago, but its lessons about inequality, survival, and reconstruction remain painfully relevant to our modern world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most devastating urban disasters. If you found yourself oddly comforted by these dark historical stories, you're not alone. There's something deeply reassuring about exploring humanity's past struggles from the safety of our modern world. It reminds us both how far we've come and how resilient people can be when facing seemingly impossible challenges. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into the Great Fire of London, consider subscribing to join our growing community of history enthusiasts who find peace in the past's most challenging moments. And let us know in the comments what other historical disasters or difficult periods you'd like us to explore together. Your suggestions help shape our little corner of the internet, where we find comfort in learning about times when life was significantly more challenging than our current struggles. Until next time, sleep well knowing that you're safe from the fires that consumed medieval London. But never forget the lessons they taught about survival, society, and the unpredictable nature of human civilization. The Great Fire of London may be ancient history, but its flames still have much to teach us about the world we live in today.